We'll get started now, if that's okay. We may have a few stragglers, but let's get underway at this time. So welcome to this book talk session. I'm Dr. Warren Carter. I'm the Meinders Professor of New Testament here at Phillips, and it's my delight and privilege to introduce Dr. Lisa Barnett, although she probably doesn't need introducing for most of you. But the formalities. So Dr. Barnett is Associate Professor of American Religious History and Director of Formation for Disciple Students here at Phillips. She did her PhD work in the History Department at Texas Christian University.
Go Frogs!
I never understood it when I was there, and I still don't. Never get the claw right. Anyway, and TCU, and focusing on US history since 1877, and specifically Indigenous history and American religious history. She has 2 master's degrees from Bright Divinity School, Master of Divinity, and a Master of Theology degree in history. She's also an ordained minister in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Dr. Barnett currently serves as a trustee for the Disciples Historical Society. She oversees the Isaac Errett Student History Paper Competition and is the co-moderator of the Center for Indigenous Ministries in the Disciples of Christ. Dr. Barnett has written a number of articles published in various scholarly collections. She has an essay in this particular book, a history of border policing, a history of enforcement. Okay, I moved. And evasion in North America. Stop talking. And she has another forthcoming essay, which has a really interesting title: Oklahoma Women Lead the Way into the KKK, a collection for a collection of studies entitled American West Between the World Wars, forthcoming from University of Oklahoma Press. In addition to being a fine scholar, Dr. Barnett is an excellent teacher and faithful and reliable in her faculty duties. She's a regular preacher in disciples' congregations in our area. So this afternoon, the focus is on her recently published book with the red jacket, entitled Peyote Politics, The Making of the Native American Church, 1880 to 1937, published by University of Oklahoma Press. I've read this book, and I've reviewed it at a session available on the school's YouTube channel. It's a fine book, wonderfully researched, on a very important topic, and very clear in its argument. So please, buy a copy. But first of all, let's listen to Professor Barnett talk about it. She'll do a presentation. There'll be time for some Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Barnett to this session.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. So it's a great book review that is up on the YouTube channel for the school, so I encourage you to, see that. One of the things that I want to do, I've done several book talks, and how I like to address it is I want to provide some more insight into the research that helped frame the book. Because for students in my class that write papers, these are my endnotes. What started out as my footnotes in my dissertation that became endnotes, each one meticulously shows the research that went into the arguments made. And I know many of you, when you got the book, if you got the book, that's the first thing you did was look at my footnotes, my endnotes, and mine those, to also accompany this very extensive bibliography of pages. So I really want to kind of take you through the framing of how I put this argument together that began as my dissertation. It's actually, chapter 6 was my master's thesis at Bright Divinity School that then got expanded to my dissertation at TCU in the history department, and now my book. So, with the wonderful red cover. Okay, wait a minute. That's not the slide. There we go. Okay. So the book uses this rise of peyoteism, which is the terminology for a religious practice among Native Americans in the U.S. and also Mexico, but the rise of peyoteism, and specifically the creation of the Native American church in the early 20th century as this microcosm to explore some very controversial questions. And that's where I ground the book within the context of the time period that these conflicts are taking place and this structure of the Native American church arises, because it's incorporated in 1918, right? So we're talking early 20th century, late 19th century, where you have these very complicated notions of American identity, of citizenship status, because, fun fact, if you didn't learn it in history or you might have forgotten, Native Americans in the United States did not get, all Native Americans get full citizenship status until 1924 with the Snyder Act. And even then, it took until 1944 for some tribal nations to get full voting rights. So, Native Americans are not necessarily citizens, and yet, in this controversy around their religious practice, they are claiming First Amendment freedom of religion rights. And that's what's so fascinating. So it's a social history that encompasses political, legal events surrounding the practitioners. Now, I will say sometimes in the terminology, I do tend to sometimes use the word Indian as a historical term, because that's prominent in the research. And it's also specifically related to federal Indian policy. And for those of us in Oklahoma, it is a sort of self-identifier for a lot of Native American populations today. So the goal is to historicize peyoteism within this history of Indian country that sees religion and spirituality as part of a broader political struggle. Yes, I said it, religion is political, all right? And peyoteism is political as well. It's bound up in these struggles of identity and land and sovereignty. And so the book argues that Native Americans who were peyotist resisted attempts to secularize their religious practice by utilizing the American political and legal systems and ultimately incorporating as the Native American Church in 1908 to secure their religious freedom. And in this process, they are forming this new hybrid cultural identity, namely being Native American, that emphasizes the real possibility of honoring Native identity as well as American identity on the path to citizenship status. It is their opponents, who are both Native and non-Native, but it's mainly non-Native Americans, who are working to prohibit the religious practice by trying to transform the peyote cactus into something like a narcotic. I'll get to that. So the time period 1880 to 1937 really focuses on the rise of the spread of peyoteism throughout Indian country, as well as a series of federal and state efforts to try to suppress the practice, 1937 being the last congressional attempt. It's really not until 1965 that the federal government is able to be successful by declaring an act on the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to be a dangerous drug. And then it's 1970 with the Controlled Substance Act that peyote is listed as a Schedule I hallucinogenic substance with a high potential for abuse. Now let me start out by saying peyote is a sacred medicine to indigenous peoples. It heals. It is part of a religious practice that is part of healing ceremonies. But this sacred medicine has been turned into a profane object by a lot of white Protestant missionaries and by a lot of non-natives at that time who are more concerned with trying to get citizenship status and sort of throwing peyotists under the bus in the process. So, the book is divided into, I know the slides, it's hard to read, but it's 3 parts, and so I'm going to take each part just a little bit. The part 1 focuses on the 2 chapters there, religious identity. And here's where I try to help us rethink what is religion. Religion, I say, based on people like Peter Berger and the Sacred Canopy, is a product of the society from which it springs. That is the sacred canopy which every human society builds over its world to give it meaning. Thomas Tweed writes, religions are cultural processes whereby individuals and groups map, construct, and inhabit worlds of meaning, and they involve power as well. And you see that power play over what is the right religious practice in the early 20th century. We still see that power play today. So my argument is that religion itself is a social construct, much like gender and race, right? But it provides meaning for certain people. So chapter 1, I identify peyoteism as a new Native American religion. Here is the cactus of peyote, and the tops of the cactus are what is harvested and dried into those little buttons that are ingested, or they can be steeped in hot water and made into a tea. That's often for women in childbirth. They're given that as part of the tea. But during the peyote ceremony, most often it's those buttons that are ingested. It produces a mild hallucinogenic state. Mild. And it's non-addictive. There has never been any instance of addiction coming from the ceremonial use of peyote. And that's something that I want to stress too. Peyote is used within the concept of ceremony. It is not a recreational sort of substance, drug, or whatever to be used. No one has ever died from the use of peyote. So, it grows naturally in a certain growth region, and you can see some of the area. This growth region, from some of the maps there, South Texas into northern Mexico. That's the early natural growth region. In Texas, particularly over along the Rio Grande, down south, and then over in the Chihuahuan Desert by the El Paso area. Sadly, though, climate has kind of taken it to now it's just available in 4 counties in Texas where it grows naturally. So the habitat has shrunk. And it still grows naturally in Mexico, but guess what? As of 1970, being a Schedule I drug, you can't carry it across the border because that's drug trafficking. Right? So the supply is somewhat limited too. Peyote actually starts as a religious practice in Mexico with tribes like the Huicholes, who do a peyote hunt and have a ceremony with dancing and outdoor all-night celebration. So much so that when the Spanish come to Mexico, it gets picked up and noted in the Inquisition records there in 1620. We, the inquisitors, against heretical perversity and apostasy, inasmuch as the use of the herb or root called peyote has been introduced into these provinces, it is an act of superstition, condemned and opposed to the Holy Catholic faith. Ironically, this is the same argument. It's a superstitious practice that Protestant ministers will use in the late 19th, early 20th century to try to make the practice suspect. Now, interesting, when it comes across to the United States via certain tribes that start in southwestern Oklahoma, it's the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache where the ceremony first starts. The ceremony itself transforms itself from Mexico. It is not the outdoor ceremony, it's still all night, but it's not the outdoor with the dancing. Now it's coming to designated Indian reservations with white Indian agents always watching you, the panoptical gaze, right? And so it goes indoor into the teepee, And there's no dancing, which is really unusual for Native American ceremonial practices. And it becomes an all-night service of contemplative prayer, hymn singing in their language, cultural adaptation, with a ceremonial structure that develops. So in Oklahoma, these are the tribes when it first comes into the border, not United States. It starts to change as it goes north to northeastern Oklahoma, and then this one from Stewart, it goes up to the northern plains, and then it goes out west. Particularly Nevada, Utah, the Utes, Paiutes, the Navajo, that ceremony. So one of the cool things, I got to hire a cartographer to make 2 maps for the book. So one of these maps combines some of the natural growth region, and the numbers indicate kind of the anthropological work on how it progresses north, at least, from the Kiowa Comanche and then up. So with the Kiowa Comanche, it's Quanah Parker and others within the Comanche tribe that start to spread this peyote religion through the half-moon ceremony. And what's important is that there is a dirt altar that is built, and a peyote cactus is set on top of the altar. It is not to worship the peyote, but peyote is a means to help individuals hear from Creator and to get healing from Creator by hearing what Creator has to say to help the community. And so the veneration with the altar and stuff there. Now within the half-moon ceremony, and images like this from the late 1800 anthropological study by James Mooney, you can kind of see the dirt and how it's put there. There are no Christian elements. It is entirely based upon culture and the language within the tribes. As it spreads, though, people like James Wilson, a Caddo Delaware who's familiar, starts to add some variations to the ceremony, and he starts to elongate the altar so that you can kind of see this cross formation. And he also starts to add some Christian elements to the ceremony itself. There's new songs to the ritual, ethical teachings, no alcohol, no tobacco in the service, Christian symbolism. And the more it goes north to the northern plains in Nebraska, the more Christian elements it takes on. Oh, sorry, Dan, I know you said we're taking a picture there, okay? The more Christian elements it takes on with John Rave and Albert Hensley there. And in fact, by the time it gets to the crossfire ceremony, you have on the dirt altar peyote and an open Bible, because peyote will help you understand the scripture, right? When you hear Creator speaking to you. And there's a little baptism service and stuff. There's a lot more study that needs to be done, because there's actually a split in the practice of peyote over theological issues between Rave and Hensley that need to be studied just a little bit more. And then, of course, you have some other tribes. The Osage have their own ceremony that came with Black Dog, too, who began putting in Wilson's Big Moon ceremony, and it turns the altar to face the west, unlike the altar facing the east, because Black Dog insisted that an Osage could not look east for spiritual direction, but had to look west where the sun was leading, not where it had been. And he also claimed that nothing good can come from the east, i.e. Washington, D.C., and federal Indian policy. And then the Navajo have their own ceremony in a hogan structure made of logs. But images like this, you can start to see with the cross on the peyote fan, some of the syncretism that starts to come in the American religious practice. And you get different structures, the teepee as well as the Osage more wood structure. There are certain roles in the ceremony. The roadman is not necessarily the leader. The roadman is the organizer. Peyote ceremonies occur only when someone in the community has a need for it and calls for a healing or a healing in the community, a healing in the spirit, or whatever. And so the roadman is the one who has to make sure that you have the peyote and you have the drum chief and the fire chief and the water woman. The water woman is one who comes at designated breaks during the night where you can, because it's an all-night ceremony where you're sitting on the ground. There are breaks where you get to stand and you get the water, and then at the break, when sunrise comes and the ceremony ends, it's the water woman who signals that the ceremony is done. And a lot of that comes from, I think I explored in the chapter, the myth that a woman and her son, sound familiar? A woman and her son are lost in the desert, separated from her people. And this figure appears, supernatural figure appears, creator, that says, if you take this peyote, it will guide you back to be reunited with your people. And thus, the origin of peyote. So, chapter 2 talks about now this thin line. Already, federal government is creating problems for religious practices for Native individuals. The Office of Indian Affairs, which is now the BIA, implements a religious crime codes outlawing dances. They start to issue orders making peyote illegal, categorizing it as an intoxicant. Even Oklahoma Territory officials are trying to suppress it. That gets repealed. You've got the Department of Agriculture getting involved. The post office prohibits the mailing of peyote shipments, 1917. Remember, even sexually explicit birth control and stuff like that got prohibited in the mail, so the post office steps in thinking they can do it. And then from 1916, almost regularly to 1937, Congress is introducing legislation to try to ban peyote. And it's one senator, Robert Owen from Oklahoma, who really is the key to stopping some of that legislation from being passed. But you also have opposing peyote, founded in 1911, the Society of American Indians, which is interesting because the leadership is mainly mixed blood, boarding school educated Native Americans, and the goal of the society is to achieve citizenship status for all Native Americans. And so when the controversy over peyote starts to arise as a superstitious practice, the Society of American Indians ends up throwing peyotes under the bus. Because again, the goal is assimilation as an American citizen, which means abandoning tribal cultural practices. Surprisingly, one of the biggest opponents out of the Society of American Indians, she'll come up again, Gertrude Bonin, Sitkala Shaw, who is a Yankton Sioux and secretary for the Society of American Indians and a missionary, Protestant missionary as well, is opposed. But one of the chief supporters, besides Robert Owen, is the son of Irish immigrants to this country, Catholic, James Mooney, who's an anthropologist with the Smithsonian, who comes to Oklahoma to study specifically the peyote religion. And it's actually him that took those pictures. They're posed pictures, but those are pictures that Mooney takes in the late 19th century. One of the expenditures he has is for a camera. So it is a new American religion, but we don't think about it as an American religion, but it is, right? Part 2 talks about racial identity, and this is my chapter on from the borderlands to the bordered lands of Indian reservations. There is a commercial trade that develops, and the center of it is Laredo, because that's where 4 different railroads intersect, and the shipment from Mexico on some of the railroads. And I've got these, I know it's really hard to see there, but I break it down a little bit. You can see where 4 different railroads kind of cut through and cross. You can also see out of Laredo, those little colored dots are documented peyote growers at this time period who would harvest the peyote, dry the buttons, take it to Laredo, and trade it for goods at one of 2 mercantile stores. There were several along the way, but they would trade it for goods. So there was a commercial trade that starts to develop. So my other map that I had my cartographer make shows the railroads from Laredo, and then you can see the railroad lines that run up right next to some of the Indian reservations in Oklahoma. And that's how it gets shipped up. And that's how then the religion begins to spread. Really fascinating. One of the companies out of Laredo is Villegas and Brothers, later Villegas and Sons, but it becomes one of the biggest commercial traders for peyote. And in fact, there's Villegas, one of his former employees, Julio Wormser, starts his own mercantile store, and that too is a fascinating story because Julio Wormser is actually Julius Wormser and his brother Ferdinand, who are German Jews who immigrate to Texas, and he suddenly takes on this Tejano identity and is very revered in the Laredo area. So that too is just another fascinating story. But here's a map I discovered. These are little dots next to reservations because you couldn't ship it directly to the reservation. What had to happen was some of the white drugstores would get the shipment and then sell it to Native Americans as their sacred medicine, right? And that's how they were able to get it. And so I love this from 1899. Speaking of the new law, this trader said it would prove ineffectual. The mescal bean, and that was part of the problem, it got termed early on as mescal bean, but it was not, but it means peyote, comes from far southwest where it grows wild. Instead of buying it at Mangum in Greer County, the Indians buy it at Vernon, Texas. Here we go. The only way to give proper effect to the law is to induce the states of Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas to pass similar laws and in that way build a wall around Oklahoma and make Texas pay for it. Or Kansas, or right? So, but here's how it gets racialized. The newspaper headlines. Indians are made insane by eating Mexican beans, right? So this is the attempt of opponents utilizing the press in order to support a particular political agenda. And one of the more fascinating things that I found comes in chapter 4 is that it's this, peyote often gets compared in the press to opium, marijuana, and cocaine. It's not like any of those, but that's how it gets compared. So in this chapter, I kind of traced this war on peyote. This was a really cool find when I got to go to the Anthropological Archives in D.C. and spend a week out of James Mooney's file. He was the first, as far as we know, white man to be invited to a peyote ceremony, and this is his invitation where he writes mescal eating, and he shows where the mescal teepee, and that's part of the vernacular that he ascribes early on. He later says that was a mistake calling it a mescal bean, but that was his invite to the peyote ceremony. And so then you get these headlines, war on peyote drug. Early on, let's claim it as an intoxicant like alcohol, because we already have this trope, right, of the drunken Indian. But notice in the second cartoon, the alcohol bottle has peyote written on it from this political cartoon. It's called dry whiskey in a lot of places. But they're not able to stop it because the laws aren't working. So it's not being labeled an intoxicant as much. Now, because of the Food and Drug Act and the Harrison Narcotic Act, specifically in 1914, now we're going to call it dope, hashish. It's a drug in Cult of Death. And now the headlines make it clear the Indian office is going to wage war on this drug in order to free from the subtle slavery of the mescal bean. And not only is it going to be a war on drugs, it's going to be a holy war. It's going to be a religious war on drugs. Oh, one more. Yeah, religious war aids the Indians to retain their drug. Now remember, it gets compared to opium, cocaine, marijuana. Doris Provine's chapter 3 in her book, Unequal Under the Law, puts it into this early race war on drugs. Remember, 1882 is the Chinese Exclusion Act, so opium gets compared to the Chinese, cocaine with African American, particularly men in the South, and Mexican for the marijuana. And it becomes a concern among Christian missionaries. It's going to lure them away from Christianity, not understanding that they can be both, Christian and peyotist, right? But this idea that it's waging a war with these instructions. And some of the reasons that they're giving, oh my goodness, encroach upon the time that should normally be devoted to work. We familiar with Weber's Protestant work ethic there, right? Before it's time. If they're at an all-night ceremony, first of all, they're not going to come to church on Sunday morning at our church. And then they're not going to tend to their crops, right? Because we're trying to remake a culture into what we view as an American. And then, this is something that needs to be explored more. Just up the road in Pawhuska, this Law and Order League is kind of the precursor to the KKK here in Oklahoma. That they're going to take this up as a moral issue as well. And again, one of my great finds from the anthropological archives, this is from southeastern Oklahoma, and it is a KKK warning to peyotists. And it basically says, our government has spent and is spending thousands of dollars each month to educate and uplift the Indians. How dare you take that education and that money and waste it on these superstitious practices? Because our goal is to create something different. And so the politics then of political identity, we're trying to go from that to that. I love Puck Magazine and some of this satire cartoons. So chapter 5 talks about the use of the legal and political systems. Again, made insane, made insane by eating these Mexican beans. One death has occurred, that is not true. But we have some court cases that come up. One is here in Oklahoma, or in the territory of Oklahoma. Howling Wolf, Reuben Taylor, and Percy Cable, someone rats them out on the reservation that they have been to a peyote meeting, and so they are arrested, and there's a raid where they're arrested. They're taken to court for violating Section 2652 of the Oklahoma Territorial Statutes, which prohibit the possession of the mescal bean. Well, guess what? They get some good lawyers, and guess what the lawyers argue? Not a mescal bean. Peyote is not mescal, right? So they're acquitted, basically, out of the conviction and stuff, and that's what then gets the territorial statute repealed when Oklahoma does become a state. There's another case then that I talk about in the book, Montana versus Big Sheep in 1924, where now they're starting to claim religious identity, that this is a First Amendment practice that we ascribe to, and we should be guaranteed First Amendment rights there. This case shows the willingness of peyotists to kind of locate their religious identity within this framework that is protected by the Constitution. And in fact, the headlines say that. Let us keep our religion. And they start to lobby. They swarm the State House in Oklahoma. Hundreds of different tribes coming to lobby against a law that's coming. And each time, again, this is kind of hard to see, but there are state laws that get repealed, but there are several states that also start to take action as well as federal government. But the fascinating thing is that the peyotists begin to enter this political arena. So they're using the court system, but now they're going to use the political system. They're going to go to Guthrie, which was the capital of the Oklahoma Territory, right, to fight the mescal bean and peyote bill. And they even meet with a delegation of the medical committee before the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention there in 1907. Quanah Parker, front and center, there. And out of this chapter 5, I talk about this idea of dress. I'll get to that in a minute, but they're lobbying. Hundreds lobby for peyote from the Daily Oklahoman in 1908. Quanah Parker is going to lobby not only in Guthrie, but go to Washington, D.C. He's made 17 trips to Washington, D.C. to work on trying to stop legislation. Osages who have some money go to Washington to ask for the ban. It's hard to see this picture, but I loved it. It's one of the few pictures where this is the Osage delegation in Washington, D.C., talking before Congress, lobbying there. They're heard on the committee, lobby, even up in North Dakota, South Dakota, they're lobbying. So one of the things at the end of the chapter is this idea of dress for success, again, utilizing white clothing. Citizens' clothing is what it gets called. Christian citizenship, citizens' clothing, and Indian agents are regularly turning in reports. Well, X number of people are dressing in citizens' dress, right? And so they're using this idea of political identity in clothing versus the blanket sort of rhetoric of old. So there's Quanah Parker, and then there's Quanah Parker playing to a political audience, right, in the optics. The best one, though, is Gertrude Bonin, said Kalashaw. Carlisle educated, plays the violin, classically, musically trained, but then she also has what she calls, in her own words, a costume that she puts on when she goes out to try to raise money for her mission work. In fact, there's one letter that she wrote in the SAI papers. I went through all the microfilm of those too, where she's like, yes, sometimes you have to dress like the clown in order to be, what people want. She makes the mistake, though, at the 1918 congressional hearings, when she shows up in Washington, D.C., and she makes the Washington Times with this picture to fight peyote in those congressional hearings, because it's James Mooney that takes her to task when he gets to speak in support of peyote. He says, she doesn't even know what she's dressed as. That's not a Yankton Sioux dress, that's a Southern Plains Indian dress. The belt that she has is for a man, not for a woman. And he even calls her out, saying that the fan that she's holding is a peyote fan. After he takes her to task, the Smithsonian pulls him from field work in Oklahoma back to Washington, D.C., and he never gets to return to finish his work on peyote, and he ends up, dying. He still lobbies, while he's in D.C. and working with tribes, but he never gets to come back to do his field work. So the last chapter really talks about using the First Amendment. Now, before the Native American church, there was another church incorporated up in the Otoe area. The Otoe, and this is a chapter in another forthcoming book, American Religion in the West, that'll be coming from the University of Nebraska. It's incorporated in 1914 in Red Rock, Oklahoma, as the Firstborn Church of Christ. But it's an Otoe peyote church. The lawyer from Perry, Oklahoma, who helps the Otoe incorporate this church is Henry S. Johnston, who was a member of First Christian Church, Perry, Oklahoma, a good disciple minister, right? So thus you kind of get that Church of Christ, but also a proponent of the Otoe people. It's renamed in 1920 the Church of the Firstborn. And it started by Charlie Whitehorn and Jonathan Koshaway, who Koshaway had studied Bible teachings with Charles Taze Russell of the group of Russellites that later become the Jehovah's Witnesses. In 1920, Koshaway joins the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is preaching for them. But he's the one that spreads peyote out to the American West into Utah and Nevada via his Mormon kind of connections there among the Navajo. A lot of anthropologists just assume when the 1918 Native American church is incorporated that this church went away. But it doesn't. A lot of times when I go back and read obituaries in the Ponca City newspaper, you see they have two peyote churches, the Firstborn Church and a chapter of the Native American church that is still in existence both today. Yeah, it's fascinating. But in 1918, seeing after those hearings in Washington, D.C., that there may be some handwriting on the wall, Native Americans in Oklahoma decide to incorporate. They don't necessarily mention peyote in the letters, articles of incorporation, but they're incorporating as a church. They're heavily influenced by two things: the Shaker Church in the Pacific Northwest and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have been persecuted as a religious group in America. And so peyotes can sort of relate to them. So this is what church looks like for the Native American church. It's not the regular building, a regular service on Sunday morning, but only when it's called for, in a structure, sitting all night. Now, in 1955, it goes to the North American church with a card, which is interesting. The card is really important today. Because of that Controlled Substance Act, you have to have that card, right? But notice, this is for the Navajo tribe, a member in good standing of the Native American Church of North America, fighting for freedom of religion, and is entitled to all the rights, privileges, services, etc. there. So not only do they start to use the rhetoric of church, they use the rhetoric of sacrament. In fact, I met a roadman with the Comanche a few years ago, and I told him I was working on my dissertation on peyote, and the first thing out of his mouth, "You know it's a sacrament." Yes, I do. It is sacred medicine. And he's like, "Okay, you are cool." Because, he understands, but he understands that you know what you're talking about. So it's a practice of the peyote sacrament. Peyote Indians and supporters start using this analogy of the Christian Eucharist to translate the ceremony into terms that non-Indians and non-peyotists could understand. In fact, in 1908, one Iowa Joseph Springers testifies, "We use this medicine as the Catholic people use wine as a sacrifice, and just the same as Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and other denominations break bread and wine." And so the popular press then in 1908 starts picking up on this Eucharistic language and starts calling peyote a sacrament. But let's think historically. From 1912 to 1919, Congress is passing legislation to prohibit the manufacture and sale of intoxicating beverages, prohibition. But always there is an exception for the use of sacramental wines to be used in religious services for Catholics and for Jews. And so peyotists get word that, hey, there's an exception for sacramental wine. We can use that. So when they organize, they use the term peyote sacrament in their articles of incorporation to also claim First Amendment religious protection. And so they organize a church. And the missionaries are still going to fight it, but they're going to organize a church. And as I said, it's not until 1965 that the federal government is able, with an amendment, to get it on the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act as dangerous, and then 1970 as a controlled substance. So now, besides the membership card, it's a heavily regulated industry. To grow peyote in South Texas as a peyotero, you have to have a license from the state. To ship it across state lines, you have to have the documentation filed with the Department of Transportation in Texas. And of course, you have to have a Native American membership card in case of anything. There have been some court cases kind of along the way the Oregon v. Smith case, right? The employee and stuff. Thomas Marukas's book actually deals more with some of those. The Peyote Road is the name of his book. Deals with more of those contemporary cases. But another big concern right now, climate change and agribusiness that has plowed over the natural growth region of peyote, both in northern Mexico, but peyotes here in the U.S. can't get it there, but in those 4 counties in South Texas, plowed over a lot of the natural growth region. And so the limited supply increased the cost, right, in order to conduct a peyote ceremony. So there's some big concern about the conservation there. But it was just a fascinating subject. There's still a lot more to write. This is another Woody Crumbo painting. That's the cover for the book. This is a Woody Crumbo painting that's out at the Gilcrease Museum here in Tulsa that the OU Press got permission from the Crumbo family to use for the cover. This is another one of the images that I love that's also out at the Gilcrease collection here in Tulsa. But there's a lot more in the book that I hope you read, you learn something from. But again, it's kind of contextualizing this American religious practice within the late 19th, early 20th century. And so I'll take some questions, yeah.
Well, as you were talking about that, it's like year after year after year after year, things are going on in D.C. to come against it.
Mm-hmm.
What was the driver for that? Who was getting power or money to make that worthwhile?
It's the congressmen from a lot of the states because they're going up against this idea of citizenship. There's this pressing need from the Society of American Indians and from several Congress people to actually make Native Americans U.S. citizens, because even the 14th Amendment for, freed enslaved individuals, formerly enslaved individuals, did not affect Native Americans. They were still not considered citizens of the United States. And so there's this huge push with wave after wave of immigration coming in and assimilation. Well, we're going to have to make Native Americans citizens. How are we going to incorporate them into the body politic? That's the big concern. And so there are groups like this, the Friends of the American Indian Lake Mohonk Conference. All these white people meet together to decide what's best of how to assimilate Native Americans into American culture and society, and proposing all of these things. And a lot of with peyote that's a superstitious practice. They're ignorant. They're not going into the modern era, because at that time too, folks, this is the fusing of Christian nation, patriotism, Christian nationalism. And if you can't be a good patriotic American, right, by being a Protestant practicing Christian, then that's some of the concerns. And so it's the big missionary groups as well within denominations that are opposing this. Yes, sir.
Is there a similar situation that happened with a lot of the Mesoamerican people?
Right, with the Mexican Revolution. Yes, yeah. And that's where a lot of the religious suppression took out a lot of the practice among some of the tribes. The Huicholes are still the biggest group in Mesoamerica within Mexico that still practice the traditional ceremony and do the annual peyote hunt and stuff. But it did stamp the religious practice out in some areas in Mesoamerican with the Diaz Revolution. Yeah. And that also then, once that free trade zone too with the Mexican Revolution stops the trade at Laredo from coming across, and we get the creation of the Border Patrol and stuff like that, that also helps hurt some of the Mesoamerican practices. So yeah, good question. With the analogy between Mexico and the United States is very, very similar at that time period. Yes? Mm-hmm. This seems to overlap with that time frame. Oh my gosh, yes, it does. And that's part of the problem, is that a lot of the the Society of American Indians have been educated and achieved some respectable status in society. But a lot of the peyotists learn about peyote while they're at the boarding school from some of their other family and friends back home. And the big concern is that once they leave the boarding school, they're going to go back to their cultural tribe and pick up this religious practice. And a lot of them do, because here's the thing. I talk about it being a sacred medicine. Time after time, students who come back to their tribes to participate in the peyote religion are saying, it cured me of the consumption that I got at the boarding school. Tuberculosis is running rampant in those boarding schools, and people are dying. And it's the peyote that's being sent to them, or they're coming back on a visit or something, and that they're claiming cures them. And during the when it gets compared to being an alcohol-like substance, dry whiskey, people are saying, no, it actually cures alcoholism. And there's some psychologists or some studies done today by some social workers and some medical doctors and stuff where it does cure alcoholism. There's an ethical frame around the use of peyote within ceremony where you eschew alcohol and other substances that harm, I can cite the sources, I've got them in here, but yeah, there's some great work being done on why it should be, traditional practices should still be utilized today as a method of therapy for alcohol and drug addiction. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
He has visions, and there is no mention in his autobiography,
mm-hmm.
that he was using any substances.
Yeah, Black Elk is an interesting figure because the historical question, did Black Elk really write the book, or did the Catholic missionary that helped convert Black Elk really write the book, right? You know, so there's that controversy. Peyote actually first appears probably around 1880 is the first documentation by Indian agents where a ceremonial practice is occurring. But not to say. And then it starts in Oklahoma, it comes from Mexico to Oklahoma and then spreads north. But there are other hallucinogenic substances that other tribes use. And even without the aid of a hallucinogenic substance, even the idea of like a sweat lodge ceremony, where a revelatory revelation and the experiential aspect of religion kind of comes into play, that revelations can occur. And that's something, too, that mainly, Protestant Christianity at that time, I mean, if we're talking denominational, no. The Bible, as God's word interpreted by the preacher, is the revelation, the only revelation that's allowed, right? And so that then, but lots of tribes, you're right, Black Elk probably did have some visions. Because a lot of ceremonies going off on a quest, a vision hunt, right, out by yourself to hear from Creator what to do with your life. It's all about experiencing Creator in a very tangible way. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yes, sir.
Tribal Indians also had vision quests, and it's usually associated with the rock art, the petroglyph quest.
Mm-hmm.
But they usually did it by fasting, not by
There's actually some studies done. There's some rock art down in the Big Bend area of Texas that shows peyote ceremonies. That's interpreted as peyote ceremonies early on from, again, the influence from some of the Mesoamerican tribes coming up from northern Mexico. So yeah, so it's an old practice. I mean, even when the Inquisition, 1620, is documenting the use, right? Oh, they didn't. It was James Mooney that first did. When he writes, he misunderstands it as the mescal bean, Because when Quanah Parker testifies to Congress, or maybe the Oklahoma Territory, no, we know the difference, and this is not it, because we know that other is dangerous, right? So they know, but it gets picked up by Mooney and then spread by the press, dubbed as the mescal bean early on. Bradley?
In Oklahoma specifically, did you find individuals in the ministry or churches even that are friendly and helpful in protecting this tradition for the indigenous folks? I know that you mentioned the lawyer who happened to be
Right.
first Christian. So are there more folks helping the Native Americans keep this identity for themselves, or in not trying to take it on with them, but maybe just help them protect that right?
Right.
They're going for their First Amendment right.
And there are a few more. The Oklahoma territorial hearings and stuff with the state constitution and stuff document some of those voices, and some of the congressional hearings document some of the missionaries. But they're more individual missionary people rather than a denominational sort of stance. Most of the denominational stance is, no, it's not part of the way to evangelize and get Native Americans into the Christian church, or the Baptist church, the Methodist church, whatever. But there are a few individuals that buck the system too. Yeah. Oh, Dan?
Yeah, I just want, the peyote fan, was that part of the ceremony?
It is.
And I noticed, I met people that showed me, rattles.
There's gourds, rattles.
They said that the beadwork was peyote bead.
Yes, there's a whole little subgenre of artwork, of music, peyote hymns in different languages, peyote beadwork, peyote artwork, the peyote fans. But yeah, it's all for the ceremony, and it's kind of become its own little commercial field, if you will. You can Google peyote songs and buy CDs of some of the local artists. There's a real famous Ponca Indian who does a lot of the songs and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of this own little subgenre of the, I guess I would call it like Christian music, the praise band kind of stuff, where you can buy those kind of CDs and stuff. Or, Christian artwork and Christian liturgy. The Peyote Church as well, Native American Church, has their own thing. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly some of the things you were researching. What are you working on writing after doing all of this? What's your next presentation on this topic?
Oh my gosh. Off of this, one of the things when I get my sabbatical next year, hopefully, knock wood, trustees, if you're listening, the phrase citizens' clothing, Christian citizenship is the thing that keeps cropping up. And I really want to explore that just a little bit more. What exactly is meant by Christian citizenship in the early part of the 20th century for Native Americans as well as for other immigrant groups too. And because I really think this is that fusing of kind of that Christian nationalism. And that ties into my other project off of that, Oklahoma Women Lead Their Way into the KKK, this essay that's coming out in that book. There are these other little groups in Oklahoma, particularly with women, that the editor of that book is also the editor of the women's series at OU Press, and she's like, oh, you've got to write more about all of this and look at some of the personalities. So those are kind of the two book projects. But I also want to go deeper into Raven Hensley and John Wilson and some of the Christian theology that gets fused into the peyote ceremony with the syncretism with the practices. Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
Well, I just want to know, what about your research surprised you the most? Because I know people ask me specific questions, but you've done a lot of research on this, but what kind of shocked you?
I think the thing that shocked me, a couple things early on, the fact that peyoteism is not deemed an American religion practice by a lot of the textbooks. It's starting to be worked in now a little bit more, but early on, no one ever considered it a new American religion. you know, like the Shakers or anything else, right? You know, or any of the Native American prophets, Neolin, Tenskwatawa, Handsome Lake, right? They're not considered that prophetic voice within those communities as part of American religious history. But I think the thing that really surprised me about this was this early war on drugs that was emerging in the early 20th century, and this attempt to try to bring Native Americans into that. I mean, we typically think, you know, Reagan and Nancy, right, the war on drugs, but it starts in the early 20th century. And that's another thing too, along with alcohol and that drug, that's where the KKK start to come in as the moral police of society to try to stamp those things out. So there's all these weird kind of connections there. So yeah. Anyway.
All right, let's thank Dr. Barnett.
Thank you.
As I said in my introduction, please buy the book. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it from the University of Oklahoma Press website. Some bookstores do have it on the shelves. Or if you have a favorite bookstore in your own area, you can request it and they will get it for you. Lisa says she has a few copies that she's...
Like 5. I ordered a big shipment and I thought they were going to be here in time, but they're not coming till Tuesday.
So if you have...
So I have 5.
If you have $40, is that correct?
I will sell for, it's normally $45, but I'll sell them for $40. If you have a check for, I think I've still got Jenny's Venmo account too I can use since I have one yet.
Sell them for 50.
No. I'm just covering my cost plus shipping and maybe just a little profit margin.
Well, since I'm promoting it. Anyway. Anyway, our appreciation to Dr. Barnett for this fascinating study. This is a marvelous book and I think a very important issue. And I think she's given you a wonderful taste of what is in this publication. So thank you to you. And I am to remind you all of the President's reception that is starting that way in the Chapman's Commons anytime now when we arrive. So that way to the Chapman Common. So thank you.
Thank you.